All right, thank you. We'll start now. Mike Makovsky, I'm the new CEO of JINSA. Thank you very much for coming to our inaugural event of our new Iran task force, Iran at a Crossroads. There are two main reasons why we did the event today. One is because I think it's very timely. In 4 days, you have the new Iranian presidential elections. And the last time, many of you might remember, there were Iranian presidential elections. You had hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in Iran against what was perceived as fraud in the elections, in which Ahmadinejad, the current president, and then the president as well, won. No one knows if anything like that is going to happen again. Of course, what the demonstrations triggered was then a crackdown of dissent in the country, which still remains today, even stronger than it was then. In fact, again, in June 2009, in the last election, that was also 5 months into the new Obama administration. And actually, the administration was criticized a bit then, but even still today, the administration had actually missed a chance, actually, to get rid of this, the extremist regime in Tehran. Since then, we've had a UN Security Council resolution calling on the Iranians to suspend their nuclear program. Congress has imposed several rounds of tough sanctions that President Obama has signed. The EU has imposed some tough energy sanctions on Iran. The Iranian economy has suffered a good deal since then. The oil exports, for example, which is the backbone of the Iranian economy, has declined from about 2.6 million barrels a day 2 years ago to about 1.1 million barrels a day in April of this year. More important has been oil exports, revenue, actually. It's not so much the actual exports that matter, but it's the actual revenue that really matters, and that's also had a dramatic change. You've had, they've declined from about a peak of $95 billion in 2011 to about $60 billion last year. But of course, 2011 was a bit of an outlier because it's a record highest oil price, record average oil price in the world was in 2011. And actually, the last year's $60 billion revenue figure was still significant, but not as much as people might believe. It was only about a 17% drop from the 5-year previous average of oil revenue. Now, the purpose of sanctions, of course, is not really to hurt the Iranian people. It's to force the regime to stop their nuclear program. And on that level, so far, sanctions have not succeeded. General Mattis, who just left as CENTCOM commander of the U.S. Central Command, which Iran is in its area of responsibility, testified shortly before he retired, that he was asked a direct question in Congress, has diplomacy and sanctions succeeded? And he said, no, they have not. Now, that doesn't mean they won't in the future, and Congress is right now working, there's already legislation to toughen up the sanctions. Meanwhile, on its nuclear program, has continued at a pretty healthy clip. It is stocked, by some estimates, it's a stockpile of 20% enriched uranium that it could amass, that some experts believe could amass a bomb's worth of that in a few months, unless it continues to take out some of its enriched supply. Meanwhile, our Arabs and Israeli allies are rather nervous going forward about what the United States policy is. Meanwhile, we're retrenching from the region, and Iran has strengthened its position in Iraq in the last couple of years, and also most recently in Syria. So that's kind of a brief summary of where we've been since the last Iranian presidential elections in 4 years. The second reason why we held the event today was to inaugurate our new Iran task force at JINSA, and it's co-chaired by Ambassador Dennis Ross and Ambassador Eric Edelman to my left. And it's comprised of leading experts in foreign affairs, military, and energy fields. In addition to Ambassador Edelman, Ambassador Ross, we also have folks such as Mort Zuckerman, Takeyh, who's also here, Steve Rademaker is also on the panel, General Chuck Wall, General Dave Deptula, Larry Goldstein, and a number of others. We will be releasing over the following months a series of papers and reports on Iran policy to try to help inform and educate folks in the policy community and hope shape the debate a bit about issues such as sanctions, containment, the military option, and the like. And also at JINSA, we'll be creating other task forces on other subjects and doing other policy work as well. So this is just kind of a first taste of a new policy effort at JINSA. Now, let me begin with introducing the panel. I should say Mort Zuckerman was supposed to moderate the panel, so I hope you won't be too disappointed. I'm going to have to take his place. He called me a couple hours ago, or about 3 hours ago. The weather conditions in New York prevented him actually from coming, which is, he was very disappointed in. But anyway, I'll moderate. And so let me introduce, though, our panelists. First, on my left, Ambassador Dennis Ross, who's at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's there, the Distinguished Fellow and Counselor. He's been there since, first he was there right before the Obama administration from 2001 to 2009, and then he rejoined after he had a senior position on the National Security Council at the Obama White House, the Senior Director for the Central Region. Of course, Ambassador Ross, as many of you know, has played a leading role for many years in the U.S. policy in the Middle East. Ambassador Eric Edelman is currently the Hertog Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at the Philip Merrill Center at the Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. Eric, I'd like to see your business card. It has all that, but he also at Center for, he's also a Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessment. He was also a longtime Foreign Service officer, and before retiring from the government, his last position was he was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2005 to 2009 in the Bush Pentagon. To his left is Ray Takeyh, is a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He also served as a senior advisor in the State Department at the beginning of the Obama administration. And finally, to his left is Steve Rademaker, who heads Podesta Group's international program and had also a long career in government, in the Congress, and in State Department. His last position before leaving the State Department was he was Assistant Secretary for a host of bureaus, including arms control, international security, and nonproliferation. All four gentlemen are members of our task force. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and take over my role of moderator and begin the panel. And we'll have a discussion up here, and then we'll do some Q&A. So thank you. Okay. You know what, let me, I think the way the room is configured, maybe it'd be a little easier if I don't, here, is that better for this side of the room? Okay. Okay. I think I'll start with Ray first. I'd like to ask you a few questions, Ray, about the upcoming Iranian election in a few days. How you see, what is bringing people to the polls in Iran or not bringing people to the polls, and if you see some differences among some of the candidates in terms of at least relations with the United States or its nuclear program.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I hope everyone can hear me. It's great to be here with Dennis, Eric, and Steve, of course. I'll just say a few things as a way of introduction to this issue. I think if you look at the slate of candidates, there are 7 today out of 8. They come in sort of 3 packages. There's a sort of a centrist candidates reflected by Mr. Rouhani and a reformist, Mr. Araf. And in the middle are sort of a traditional conservatives like former Foreign Minister Velayati, and I would actually put Mayor of Tehran, General Ghalibaf, in that category. And the third are the revolutionaries, the real, authentic revolutionaries, which I would say Saeed Jalili, and before he dropped out, Ghulam Reza had all belonged to that category. And so they represent a sort of an acceptable cadre of people to the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, with exception of the reformers and Mr. Rouhani. This was an election that the regime tried very hard to actually dampen enthusiasm and reduce the level of popular participation. And it was sort of going along the tracks on that particular line. But last week, last Friday, I think there was a foreign policy debate, which was the third debate among the candidates. And I watched all 4 hours of it in segments. And that's the one where this election came to life. Because if you see everybody, well, Foreign Minister Velayati and others attacked Saeed Jalili for his nuclear custodianship of this issue. Saeed Jalili comes closest to being a sort of incumbent in this particular election because he just represents the regime and represents its continuity. And all of them attacked him for inability to manage it, inability to solve it, and particularly Velayati attacked him. Last night I read something by an Iranian political scientist and a public intellectual, a really fair guy named Zibar Kalam, who said something interesting. I was going to appropriate it, but I figure I should attribute it. He said that the attacks on Jalili in a way may have ensured his election. Because for him to be defeated now would validate the American narrative that the regime's nuclear policy is unpopular, has generated sanctions, and generated dissent. So he has to be elected now because he can't be crushed at the ballot box. So in a perverse way, the foreign policy debate may have helped Saeed Jalili. What's the role of president in this issue? Again, President Ahmadinejad, who seems absent from this election, gave a speech when he was inaugurating a locomotive factory or something, and he said, you know, I'm not involved in the nuclear issue. Just other people are. It's not me. And that's actually a reversal of position. I'm a sort of a contrarian on this because I think the presidents have had enormous impact on Iran's nuclear calculation, and I would suggest between the years 2003 to 2010, some of the most important initiatives on the nuclear issue were actually initiatives of the presidential office. The decision in 2003 to suspend the enrichment program was a presidential initiative that the Supreme Leader agreed to. The decision in 2005 to resume enrichment was a presidential decision. Candidate Ahmadinejad had campaigned on it. Obviously, the Supreme Leader agreed to that. And much of the initiatives that we saw during the past couple of years, including the Turkey-Brazil deal, were initiatives of the president that the Supreme Leader sometimes agreed to it, sometimes didn't, but he went along with it. I don't know when President Ahmadinejad says that I'm not involved in the nuclear issue, does that mean he is no longer involved in that issue, or the Office of Presidency is no longer involved in this issue? Because from 2010 onwards, this is no longer an issue that has been in the purview of Office of Presidency, and the president has done that. Now, whether the new president will actually try to restore some influence, I don't know. The wheels may be moving beyond that. Of course, if the new president is Mr. Jalili, then you begin to see the continuity and all that. I'll end with saying what's going to happen in the election, whether they go second round. It's hard for me to see this election not going in the second round, and it's hard for me to see Supreme Leader wanting this election to go into the second round, because you want to wrap this thing up quickly. You don't want to generate popular excitement, popular enthusiasm that it could lead. Hassan Rouhani's rallies are getting bigger. The criticism that's being mounted is getting more trenchant. So on the one hand, you want to wrap it up as quickly as you can, as opposed to pushing it into a second round. But the arithmetic of this doesn't add. There's about 25 million eligible voters in Iran. If 50% of them vote, that's going to get you about 25 million voters. To win in the first round, you got to get 12, 13 million voters on that. I think Saeed Jalili on his own can get 5, 6 million votes. Then the rest of it has to like appear. And it's hard to rig it to that extent. Not impossible, but hard. So either way, the new president, I'll conclude on that, is coming to his office at a time where certain institutional arrangements have been made, namely the Supreme Leader's office has much more careful management of this affair, and also it's a more mature nuclear program. It has 14, 15,000 centrifuges, it has multiple facilities, so it's hard for me to see beyond a potential deal on 20% whether the fundamentals of Iran's nuclear program are going to change. I'll stop there.
Before, I want to ask Dennis, but before I do to comment, I just wanted to clarify. So, setting aside who you think might win, do you think is there any policy differences? I know there's been some criticism in the debate about the regime and economic performance. I mean, the previous governments or current government. Is there any real import about who wins? What if it's not Jalili?
I think the reason why there are two people involved in Iranian politics that are honest. Saeed Jalili is one, and Ali Khamenei is the other. That's why Western negotiators are frustrated with one and pretend the other one doesn't exist. Doesn't make 6-7 speeches a year, a month saying that I hate America, I'm not going to deal with them. I like Saeed Jalili because of his veracity and his honesty. He's an honest revolutionary. I think with Ghalibaf, you're going to get the Larijani mind games. I think with the rest of them, you're going to get back channels, mind games, and all that stuff. You know, the stuff that Larijani used to do to Solano. We're going to get all that. With Jalili, to use a word that Eric maybe, we have moral clarity. I mean, he tells you exactly what he thinks. People ascribe that to unintelligence. I watched that debate, all 4.5 hours of it. I didn't see someone who was inarticulate or unintelligent. The least impressive person in that debate, frankly, was General Ghalibaf. The most impressive was former Speaker Khaled Adal. I didn't see Jalili as being unintelligent or impressive. He was honest. He was honest in saying that this is what I think and this is what we done. Let me just say one more thing about Iranian politics that's peculiar, and I saw this in this debate as a sort of angularity and detail. They always talk about tapes. This is a country where everybody's recording each other. For instance, there was a conversation between Ghalibaf and Rouhani regarding the 1999 student riots. And Ghalibaf said, I said this and I said that, and you didn't say this, Mr. Rouhani. Mr. Rouhani said, you remember there are tapes. Saeed Jalili defended his conduct at Almaty, where he was criticized by Velayati Almaty too, saying, look, Supreme Leader, listen to the tapes. I mean, this country, the closest example of it is like East Germany, or a place where everybody spies on each other and everybody kind of lies to each other. East Germany or State Department. No offense, Eric. That's the closest I can think of. But it is a peculiar political system riddled with mendacity. And Saeed Jalili is a kind of a fresh breath as far as I'm concerned. He's honest, and so is Ali Khamenei. So.
I'm willing to stipulate the American Foreign Service is riddled with mendacity.
Dennis. Yeah.
First, Ray's very honest. First, I'm going to say there are very few people who would admit that they watched 4.5 hours of that debate, but Ray did. And secondly, actually everybody up here served in the State Department, including Ray. Third, I guess I'd make a couple of comments. The first point is that Ali Khamenei does not want a president who's going to have independent views. The fact that he ensured that people like Mashai and Rafsanjani weren't going to be running increased the prospect that he would have a president who would not create potential problems for him. Second point, Jalili may be smart. I'm not denying that he's not smart, but if you actually looked at the resumes of these particular people who are running, the person who's probably least equipped from the standpoint of experience and know-how, particularly to deal with the range of Iran's problems, is Jalili. And yet, here's a guy who suddenly emerges as what may be the front runner, and one has to presume that's not an accident. There's no particular reason that he should have had so much attention lavished on him right away unless the Supreme Leader wanted that to be the case. The third point is that whether he's honest or he's simply a reflection of the Supreme Leader, there's no doubt that if Jalili were to become president, he would fit the bill for what the Supreme Leader wants in a president, which is to be someone who is his instrument for carrying out policy, someone who will not challenge him, someone who will not be independent, someone who, if he does things that doesn't make the public happy is great because he absorbs the criticism as opposed to the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader wants to be someone who sits above the fray and yet has policies that reflect what he wants, both in terms of, I would say, an organization internally that is based on the conservative sets of principles that he embodies and believes in, which means building much greater economic independence, even if that means enduring certain kinds of hardships, and not accommodating on the outside, because he believes that any kind of concession is something that only will whet the appetite of what he refers to as the arrogant powers, who will never be satisfied until the Islamic Republic itself is conceded. So basically, he's ensured that there weren't going to be any candidates who could be potentially problematic from his standpoint. Secondly, I agree with what Ray was saying about he probably doesn't want there to be a second round. And if he really doesn't want there to be a second round, somehow it seems to me there probably won't be a second round. Can he live with candidates other than Jalili emerging? Yeah. And I think that was the whole purpose, was to ensure that there wouldn't be anybody who would be really problematic. But it seems that he's indicating a particular preference. At least there's a number of candidates who have a history of very close association with him, including Velayati, including Ghalibaf, including Jalili, including even Rouhani. Although I saw something, Ray, I don't know if you saw this, but there was something today that suggested there's going to be an effort to disqualify Rouhani.
I think the Guardian Council is denying that now.
All right. In any case, I mean, there are candidates here who have had a long history of ties to him. And that means that no one is going to emerge who is going to be particularly problematic, but certainly someone like Jalili is going to be, I think, the epitome of what he would want as president, and therefore it seems likely that he'll do reasonably well.
Eric, please.
Both Ray and Dennis are much closer students of Iran than I am in terms of its internal politics. But one thing strikes me that is particularly relevant for the work of this panel, which is that if you compare the election today to the one in 2005 that brought President Ahmadinejad to power, the issues in that election were largely domestic economics, corruption, the corruption of Rafsanjani, and public revulsion against it. What strikes me about this election, again, I take the points that both Ray and Dennis have made, and I agree that the contours of the candidature here were set by the Guardianship Council to make sure that there was nobody who would emerge that would be a disruptive influence, as Ahmadinejad turned out to be, and as you almost got in 2009. But it does strike me as interesting that in this election, two of the candidates are either current or former nuclear negotiators, and one's a former foreign minister.
Right.
And so I think it suggests that the salience of this set of issues, the nuclear program, the negotiations, the sanctions, is much more salient this time around for Iranian voters than it was 4 years ago. And I noted the Thomas Erdbrand piece in the New York Times this morning suggesting that in the debates, sort of one of the issues that has come out is who is the most stalwart in defense of the nuclear program. And Rouhani has been criticized for having agreed to the suspension of enrichment for a brief period of time during the Iran-EU3 negotiations back in 2004, 2005, even though he has publicly said many times that that was a tactical suspension that was undertaken in order to work out some of the kinks they were having in the enrichment program. And yet now he's being subject to criticism for that.
Steve, do you want to add on that?
Well, like Eric, I'm not a great expert on Iranian politics. I follow the nuclear issue more closely, and Eric's observation, I think, is spot on. It really is. It underscores how central this issue is to Iranian politics and their national security. That 3 of the 8 candidates for president are either former negotiators or deeply involved in the management of the issue for the Iranian government. It would be inconceivable that we could have an election in the United States where people who had been that involved in this or any foreign policy issue would be that central to the final outcome of our election. So But I think what follows from that is the question, does any of this matter for what comes next? Because certainly there will be an election, there will be a new president elected after 1 or 2 rounds, and then there will be an effort mounted by, certainly by the United States, but other members of the P5+1 to revive the negotiating process. And the hope, of course, on our side will be that as a result of the election, that new things are possible that were not possible before. Will that be true? I guess time will tell. I personally am somewhat skeptical. First, to pick up on Ray's point about Jalili having been attacked in the way he was, whether that essentially compels them to vote or to elect him, lest it be seen as a repudiation of all that has come before. I think should that happen, another way of looking at that will be that the vote will be seen as an affirmation or reaffirmation of existing policy in Iran. It's certainly not a mandate for a more flexible approach to negotiations in the future. Beyond that is the obvious fact that it has always been the case that policy with respect to the nuclear program is ultimately the purview of the Supreme Leader, and the Supreme Leader is not changing. And the suggestion that the positions that have been taken up until now by Jalili in the negotiations don't reflect or are not consistent with the outcomes desired by the Supreme Leader, I think, personally, I think that's wishful thinking. I think the negotiators are mindful of what the Supreme Leader wants in this. And the ultimate issue in the negotiations is the question of enrichment, and is enrichment going to be permitted going forward or not? The Iranian position is agree to enrichment, and then all things are possible. We'll talk about limits. We'll talk about confidence-building measures. Up to this point, the P5+1 have not agreed in principle to future enrichment in Iran, and I do think that's the entire ballgame, because if it is agreed that enrichment goes forward, debating the conditions under which it happens is ultimately a debate that I think the Iranians will come out of just fine, because there's no longer the ability to object to enrichment by itself, but rather to insist that certain limits are critical, but those limits are themselves going to be arbitrary. And what I didn't hear in the debate last Friday was any suggestion that any of these candidates would advocate retreat on the fundamental question of should Iran persist with an enrichment program and insist on international recognition of that program as part of any settlement with the rest of the world.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do think, Steve, I think you raised a couple of things, but one thing I think it's worth noting: if someone like Jalili emerges, it's going to be much more difficult for the members of the 5+1 to look at Iran and say, gee, we know now that there's a partner for a negotiation, because there's a lot of experience with him, and that experience is an experience that unfortunately is unsatisfactory, to say the least. If you had had someone like Rafsanjani allowed to run and then win, there would have been almost a cottage industry saying, gee, you now have someone who's a deal maker who's ready to come and do a deal. So even the excuse to sort of leap in and do something isn't there. And ironically, this is kind of consistent with Ray's point about the honesty of Ali Khamenei, which is an interesting way. I haven't heard many people refer to the honesty of the Supreme Leader, but the fact is, the face the Iranians are presenting and are likely to present as a result of this election is that it'll be much more difficult to create that justification, unless perhaps someone like Veliati emerges, because there's a history of Veliati. So if you see someone like that emerge, or maybe even Ghalibaf, because Ghalibaf in the past has had contacts with people on the outside, those who are looking to grab onto a pretext to say, gee, we really do have an opening here for negotiations, will find it more difficult than if Rafsanjani had been there. If Jalili is the one who emerges, that just becomes very hard to do.
Let me ask you before, Eric, one second.
No, I think Dennis has just made a very important point, which is really the subject to some degree of our panel today, which is what's the impact of the election on the process of negotiating over the nuclear issue. And I think what we're likely to see now is precisely, I think Dennis is right, we're not going to see, most likely, given what way the election looks like it's going, and certainly if Ray is right that Jalili emerges, you won't have people reaching out and saying, you know, let's give it another whirl. But I think what will come back to the fore is the urgency of the issue in its own right, because we've had a kind of almost year-and-a-half pause, as it were, in the whole process, because we had our election in 2012, and then we pretty quickly, we had the Almaty sessions, but that pretty quickly went into hiatus because of the impending Iranian election. And while that's all been going on, the inexorable march of the Iranian program has continued. One little factoid that I was mentioning to Ray before we started is that if you look at the IAEA reports 4 years ago, in June of 2009, after a couple of years in which the Iranians had their program up and running, centrifuges spinning, the IAEA reported that they had 638 kilos of low-enriched uranium. If you look at the latest report issued on May 22nd, they're now up to almost 9,000 kilos, and just the delta from the February report to the May report is 689 kilos. So in the last 3 months, in essence, they produced as much as they produced in almost 2 years in between 2007 and 2009, which just is a mark of how much more efficient and how much larger scale, as Ray pointed out, the program is. And I think that is going to become the driver, not the domestic politics of Iran.
Before, I want to get back to diplomacy in 1 second. Before, Ray, I want to ask you, you mentioned how Jalili is very honest. I mean, for the last 8 years, the world, including the U.S. Congress and everyone, has really looked at the Ahmadinejad as the face, I think, of the regime, to the extent that a lot of people think the president is the bigger decision maker than the supreme leader. How are, you know, and Ahmadinejad is well known for his comments as denying the Holocaust, wiping Israel off the map. How will you think, if it was Jalili or even any of the other candidates that would emerge, will they be any different? Will this be kind of a softer, a quieter Iran, that you'll have a different face to the country?
Yeah, I think so. Saeed Jalili, in terms of his personal temperament, is a modest person. He's self-effacing. He's not provocative. He believes in all the things that President Ahmadinejad believes in. But I mean, in terms of the way he presents himself, he's likely to do so with modesty and moderation. I would say one thing about, should there be a Jalili presidency, I think there will be a case for resumed diplomacy, and it looks something like this. That the office of presidency has not been a relevant participant in the nuclear negotiations. The relevant offices have been those of the supreme leader and his personal representative at the talks. So Jalili is no longer at Almaty. He's in an office that, at this point, has been consigned to some degree of irrelevance on this issue. As I said, whether it will stay irrelevant or not, I'm not sure. And also, Jalili's deputy, Bagheri, who's his campaign manager now, makes actually a better case for Jalili's candidacy than Jalili does. He's very articulate, he's very smart, and I think the Western delegations, the 5+1 delegation, will like to deal with Bagheri over Jalili. The Bagheri-Khamenei access, I think, could invite new diplomatic initiatives.
I think it'll be hard. I mean, he did give a presentation at Tehran University going after Rouhani and explaining, you know, all the perfidy and everything that he had done to damage the Iranians.
But he's viewed as more reasonable than Jalili by those who have observed the Iranian delegation.
And let me ask you, Dennis, and then I want to go to Steve on this. What do you, the president actually, there's a transition, correct, right? So the new president takes over in August, is that right? And the Obama administration, of which you used to be a part of, it's kind of suggested that they look at these elections as important, or as perhaps an important marker about diplomacy. So where are we on timing about diplomacy here? If there's not a new president till August, I mean, there's really going to be talks before then? There's going to be a month after? Or how do you see this playing out time-wise with the election?
Well, I think the point that Eric made is the right one. There's a reality that's being created by the Iranian nuclear program. And one of the reasons we're seeing this march forward is, and the kind of progress that you cited is, they now seem to have solved their problems of the next generation of centrifuges, which for 10 years they couldn't. They're, depending upon whose calculation you use, they're at least 3 times efficient and probably more than that. So it means their accumulation of low-enriched uranium and the fact that they're continuing to produce 20% or 19.75% is going to create a reality where there's going to be increasing pressure to deal with this. And the fact that the new president doesn't assume the position until August, I don't think that will, for the administration, somehow create a reason to say, well, gee, we can't do anything until August. I think once the elections are over, you're likely to see the administration become more active on the Iranian question, partly because I would say just the march of the Iranian nuclear program, but I suspect also just because there's been so much attention has been focused on Syria at this point that I suspect that you're going to see, because there's a relationship between the two issues, but I think you're also going to see, because of that, more attention given to Iran, partly because of the march of the program, but partly also as a kind of response to the fact that on Syria, the administration has appeared to adopt a position that still seems to be studying what to do in response to the use of chemical weapons. I just think you're going to see some greater response on Syria, but also some greater response on Iran as well.
Steve, what's
Sure.
your thoughts about where we're going here? based on
Well,
what
first,
Dennis
I
said?
agree with Dennis. I think there's every reason to believe the Obama administration is ready to move forward with negotiations immediately, and probably would see no need to wait for the installation of the new Iranian president, should there be a willingness on the part of the Iranians to begin negotiating. And since the president doesn't actually control the decision-making on this, there would, in fact, be no reason not to proceed. But I guess I personally will be surprised if the Iranians want to move forward that quickly. I think they'll probably need some time to let things settle out on their side. And the fact that they're in the process of transition gives them a ready-made explanation for dragging it out for a few more months. So I do think there will be another round of negotiations in the offing. I personally will be surprised if it happens before the fall. I do think there will be a couple of other things that happen in the meantime. Most importantly, I think the U.S. Congress will become impatient looking at the data that's reported by the IAEA every 3 months. There have already been sanctions bills introduced in both the House and the Senate to further tighten U.S. sanctions. The House bill has already been reported by the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think in the Senate, there's been a conscious decision to go slowly and to put any consideration of additional sanctions off until after the Iranian election. I think the State Department has pretty clearly pleaded with the Senate to move slowly in that manner. Once the election takes place, that argument is no longer available as a reason not to move forward in the Senate. So I think we will see, as we've seen every year for the last, really for the last decade or more, sanctions legislation introduced and moving. I don't know what the reaction will be on the Iranian side. One of the obvious constraints on the U.S. Congress is that they've done all of the easy things in the area of sanctions, and what's left to do is more difficult diplomatically, practically, and the effectiveness remains to be seen. But the things that Congress has done in the last few years, I think, have proven to be more effective than many people would have expected when Congress started down the road of sanctioning refined petroleum imports or sanctioning banks that handle transactions for petroleum exports from Iran. So there are new ideas afoot, trying to expand, particularly the use of financial sanctions on foreign banks that conduct transactions involving Iran. And so the effort will be to try and turn this into not just an oil embargo, but a general trade embargo of Iran. Should those efforts succeed, I think the Iranians will not be very happy about it. How they react, I don't know. The other interesting thing that that's happened is we had Netanyahu last September drawing his red line on the Iranian program. Basically, his red line had to do with the amount of 20% enriched material that was in the possession of the Iranians. So they very cleverly and consciously adopted the policy of removing some of that 20% enriched material and beginning the process of converting it into nuclear reactor fuel. And this has been convenient, I guess, for the Iranians and the Israelis, because it has enabled the Iranians to continue producing the 20% material, but by removing some of it and beginning to convert it, the red line is not crossed. And this is a fiction that both sides seem to be comfortable with. And I suppose there's every reason for the Iranians to continue to do it, although if they choose to pay back the international community for moving forward with sanctions, I guess they have plenty of options available to them in the area of production of 20% material, in the area of deployment of new, more advanced centrifuges. I think at this point they clearly have the option of radically stepping up their rate of 3% and 20% production.
Eric, I'd like to pick up on a couple of things that Steve just mentioned. First of all, on the timing issue, does the UN General Assembly, in September, does that figure in at all into the pace of negotiations? For instance, is Netanyahu going to go back there a year after he just drew this red line? And as Steve just pointed out, the Iranians are playing around, with this line. I was just in Israel, and some folks I talked to, including some former senior officials, indicated that they thought it was a very bad red line that the Israelis, that Netanyahu had drawn, and maybe explain more why he didn't act then as opposed to when he'll act. And do you think that will influence how the Israelis, their freedom of maneuver, actually?
Well, Dennis has been in Israel more recently than I, and he may have, better observations. My own view about the point that Steve just made is that it's actually extremely interesting that the Iranians are being so careful to continue to, even as they are increasing the efficiency with which they produce uranium at enriched at 20%, that they are turning enough into uranium oxide as fuel for the Tehran research reactor. They've got way more than they could possibly ever need to fuel the TRR, but that clearly they're doing this because of the red line and wanting to stay below it. That in and of itself, I think, is a very important and interesting data point. As to the UNGA, I doubt that it'll be very specifically important to the negotiations themselves, other than the fact that it will be an opportunity for, if it's President Jalili or President Kalibaf or whoever, it'll be an opportunity for them to make their sort of maiden statement to the international community. Many people will remember President Ahmadinejad's first trip to New York, where he saw halos over his own head. So that will be an interesting moment. It'll also be an opportunity for a lot of diplomacy to go on around all of this activity, because so many leaders will be there. But I just wanted to get back to the timing point on the 20%, because our colleague Blaise Mistal has made the point in some work he has done on the analysis of the latest IAEA report from May, which is, if you look back at the amount of time it would take if the Iranians used either 2 or 3 batch reprocessing to try and make enough to make a bomb, the amount of time with each passing year has been dropping. And with the introduction of the new centrifuges, the centrifuges that Dennis made reference to, by August of this year, that amount of time could drop to 9 days. So we really are now beginning to get into the zone where talking about a breakout capability for the Iranians is not just a flight of fancy, it's actually very rapidly approaching. And let me just make one other observation about the May IAEA report, because I think it hasn't drawn enough attention and people need to start thinking about it now. For years, we've also watched the Iranians very, very slowly making progress on the heavy water reactor at Arak. The latest report suggests that reactor might actually start being fed initial fuel in the first quarter of 2014 and come online in the third quarter of 2014. What that potentially means is that we have the reverse of the situation we had with the North Korean nuclear program, where we thought with the agreed framework in the 90s that we were shutting down the plutonium route to a weapon only to discover that they had a secret enrichment program. Here we may discover that we are spending all our time trying to shut down the enrichment program only to discover that the Iranians have opened up a route to a plutonium-based weapon. And that's just something I think that people need to start factoring into their thinking about this, because it really has not been enough on people's minds.
Can I just say one thing before? In my view, I have written this, so I might as well acknowledge it in person, that the ultimate Iranian bomb requires neither the 20% fuel that's being produced nor the Fordo facility. I think the Iranian bomb can be created through the marriage of enriched uranium in large depositories and introduction of new generation of centrifuges, and both those activities are taking place in Natanz. If Iranians have large quantities of enriched uranium in an industrial-sized plant, persistent leakages from that are unlikely to be detected by the existing NPT inspection structure. And therefore, you can have small-scale facilities that are surreptitious, operating without detection because the new advanced centrifuges do not require large, elaborate ones. I think that's the path that they can. So in my view, the line that Bibi Netanyahu drew was designed to restrain him, not the Iranians. Iranians can comply with that particular line without in any way disturbing either the property or the timeline of their nuclear weapons aspirations.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
2 points. The picking up on what Eric was saying, if you look at the Iranians, the first thing that you conclude is if you actually draw a red line as it relates to the use of force, they're very careful to respect it. The second point is they seem to have a strategy that is designed to ensure that they can put themselves in a position where they don't cross their line that might provoke a reaction against them, but they're in a place where at a moment of their own choosing, they could move very quickly and present the world with a fait accompli and say, we now have the weapon. And it may well be that the essence of their strategy, and this is where the Iraq heavy water plant comes in, is to be able to do it on either of two tracks. What Ray said is right, but also, and even a lot of the estimates suggest that maybe it'll take longer on Iraq than the third quarter of 2014, but whether it's the third quarter of 2014 or the beginning of 2015, the fact of the matter is that they are pursuing a two-track approach that puts them in a position where they have quite a range of options to be able to do this and to do it very quickly, and to, in a sense, safeguard themselves until they're at that point. The key for the administration is the administration has an objective of prevention. And the real question is, what's the point at which the objective of prevention loses its meaning? Because the time the Iranians need to be able to move so quickly is at a point where we won't have the confidence that we'll have the ability to detect that. And exactly where that moment is hard to discern, but what isn't hard to discern is that it's coming sooner rather than later.
Let me get back to Dennis in a second. But Steve, when you were at State, you were Assistant Secretary. You want to address the plutonium issue that Eric had raised?
Well, I think Eric's observation is spot on. We have been very much focused on the enrichment program, and meanwhile, actually before we even knew about the enrichment program, we knew about the heavy water program, and that's what we used to be worried about. It was just on a slower timeline, but the progress on their side has continued, and we're now coming toward the end of the timeline. But I wanted to make sort of a broader observation about what's been going on and what we can expect in the months and years ahead. We've been trying to negotiate with the Iranians for a long time, and it's been a source of frustration. We've been unable to reach agreement. And so on our side, and I guess when I say our here, I mean not just the United States, but the P5+1, what has the reaction been to our frustration? It's been, well, we have to increase the pressure on Iran. We have to ratchet up the pressure. How do we do that? Well, sanctions, mainly sanctions, economic sanctions, other types of pressure, diplomatic and potential threats of military force. But principally, let's ratchet up the economic sanctions. Let's inflict pain, economic pain on the regime in order to lead them to reconsider their calculation and be more reasonable the next time we meet to discuss a potential diplomatic settlement. What has the Iranian reaction to that been? Are the Iranians saying, okay, our strategy is we're going to resist sanctions. We're going to hunker down and weather the storm. I don't think that's actually been their reaction. Their reaction, their strategy, is to pressure us right back. And they're not pressuring us through economic sanctions, but they are pressuring us through their enrichment program. What is this whole 20% enrichment thing about, which emerged out of nowhere 3 or 4 years ago, or I guess about 3 years ago? They had no plausible reason to start enriching to 20%. They claimed it was to produce fuel for their research reactor in Tehran, but at this point they've produced vastly more 20% material. I mean, they've got decades worth of fuel now for their Tehran research reactor. And what are they doing? They're installing more centrifuges and increasing the rates of production of the 20% material. So, this has nothing to do with the Tehran research reactor. It has everything to do with pressuring us. And going forward, I expect that, if we, on our side, we try and increase the economic pressure, they will continue to try and pressure us back the way they have through initiatives that they undertake with enrichment and maybe now in the area of plutonium. With regard to enrichment, I mean, some of the options are obvious. They can. They've deployed a lot of new centrifuges, many of them second-generation centrifuges that are more capable, but a lot of them are not operating. They can, and I think that's a conscious decision. They've chosen not to start spinning those centrifuges, but they're in place. They're ready to begin operating them should they choose to do so. The last time around, the main thing they did to pressure us was to increase. They had been enriching to 3.5%. They went to 20%. Well, they could go higher. 90% is weapons grade. So, do they have reasons to go above 20%? Well, potentially they could announce that. The simple thing they could do is nuclear medicine. We need to produce. Some medical isotopes are produced out of highly enriched uranium. They could announce, for medical reasons, they need to enrich to higher levels. Or another thing they could do, they can announce that they've suddenly discovered they need a nuclear navy, just like the United States and Russia. They have nuclear navies, and nuclear navies use high enriched uranium as reactor fuel for submarines and surface ships. So if they announce they're doing that, what's the reaction going to be? Well, the reaction when they came up with the 20% enrichment was a lot of hand-wringing, but at the end of the day, it was accepted. So, I mean, they have that option. And then, of course, there's the option that Eric just talked about, which is to crank up the heavy water production program.
Picking up on that, Dennis, let me ask you, how do we, going forward, and then after this, I'd like to go to Q&A with the, how do we change the dynamics here? It seems like we're stuck in the same dynamics with the talks. We have talks. It seems like our side has made concessions. The Iranians have not. Meanwhile, they're increasing their program. There are those, certainly in the region, who don't have confidence, it seems like, in the administration, that it means what it says. Of course, you have the president saying, I don't bluff. One, do you think the administration sees that it has a credibility issue, not just with its allies, but with the Iranians? And two, do you think there are things it could do to help change that perception and make people really think, that the president really isn't bluffing here, especially after what just happened with Syria and the Red Line and so on?
I don't know what the administration's view is of how the Iranians are perceiving them. I can tell you my own view is that we're actually in a place where we're increasing the prospect of the use of force simply because my sense is that the Supreme Leader doesn't believe that the administration is going to use force, and I actually believe the president is prepared to do it. So if you think about what puts you on a glide path towards the use of force, the worst possible situation to be in is the president's prepared to use force and the Iranians don't believe it. So if you want diplomacy to work, it seems to me, economic pressures have already demonstrated they're not enough. You can continue to ratchet up, but it's if we've learned anything from the last several years, it's that the economic pressures by themselves, at least for the supreme leader, are not sufficient. I do think that they've affected attitudes within the Iranian elite, but the Iranian elite as a body doesn't make the decision. The supreme leader does. And he seems to have the view that Iran has suffered much worse in the past, endured much more, and because of that, I think he wants to have nuclear weapons. And as long as they don't cross certain kinds of thresholds, like a red line that's imposed, he thinks that they can continue doing what they're doing. So if you're going to change the dynamic or you're going to change that perception, then we are going to have to do things that convince the supreme leader that, in fact, what I think is the case, meaning that the president is prepared to use force, is also something that the supreme leader believes. So what could we do to do that? I would say there's a number of different things you can do. And I'm just giving you an array of different possibilities. One thing is what we choose to do in Syria right now. If we're prepared to cross certain thresholds in Syria, that will send a message to the Iranians, particularly given their own investment in Syria. I, for some time, have favored putting more of an endgame proposal on the table as a way of saying, look, when we say that the time for diplomacy is running out, we actually mean it. So long as you go along with a step-by-step approach, the message you send to the Iranians is, no, there's still more time. And if what you're trying to do is say, our words mean something and the time is running out, then your diplomacy also has to reflect that the time is running out. Moving to an endgame proposal is a way to clarify the situation. There are other things that we could do as well. Our own rhetoric could change. Up until now, our position has been all options are on the table. Well, you could change that. You could say it should be clear to everybody that if diplomacy fails, the result is going to be the use of force. That's a very different formulation than saying all options are on the table. It also does something else. The reality that if it comes to the use of force, you can't just come to the use of force without preparing the ground in advance. So one of the ways to prepare the ground in advance is also to begin to change your rhetoric. It's also another way to send a message to the Iranians. What I'm saying is if we want diplomacy to succeed, we're going to have to change the supreme leader's calculus. And at this point, we haven't succeeded in doing so. And it seems to me the kinds of steps I've suggested, they don't exhaust the different possibilities. I have other ideas as well. But these are at least a menu of the kinds of things that could be done that I think could have that effect.
Eric, do you want to just to finish this line.
I would just add one thing to what Dennis said, and it picks up on something he said earlier. There have been any number of people, not Dennis, by the way, but who have served in the administration who have said the problem is not that urgent because we would have sufficient indications and warning of possible breakout that we would be able to, shift our position. And I think the point Dennis made earlier is that we're beginning to approach the point now where the cycle time potentially for the Iranians to generate enough fissile material to present a fait accompli is inside the ability of the IAEA inspection regime to detect it. And that, it seems to me, is the point where the rubber meets the road.
Let me ask you, Steve, just on this point. Just like Dennis said, administration could change the rhetoric. On Congress, just briefly, what do you think, for instance, should Congress have hearings on the military option? Are there things, it seems like with the sanctions sometimes there's an incrementalism in Congress. Each time another round is stronger, but they seem to shy away from, well, you talked about a virtual trade embargo, but there isn't an economic embargo now really with legislation. What could Congress do to also change, you think, this dynamic?
Congress traditionally has tried to change the dynamic by mainly in the area of sanctions. It gets more difficult in other areas, but consistent with what Dennis just suggested about the potential military option, there are ideas kicking around. Congress could authorize the use of military force at one extreme, and I think there are a few members of Congress who've talked about doing that. Post-Iraq, whether there would be a majority in Congress in favor of something like that, I don't know. But I see that as one extreme on a continuum where there are other things that Congress can do. One of the ideas that's been suggested in the past, and actually Congress has endorsed this idea, is transferring to Israel material and capabilities that would strengthen the credibility of the Israeli military option against Iran. Items like additional aerial refueling capability, tanker aircraft, bunker buster munitions. The BPC report, I guess about a year and a half ago, recommended transferring those items. The Congress enacted legislation last year calling for the transfer of those kinds of items. So they haven't actually been transferred, to my knowledge. So, but when we do talk about the military option against Iran and the military pressure, it does come from two directions. It comes potentially from the United States, but also potentially from Israel, and Congress is in a position to influence both of those.
And Ray, and then we'll go. Just to finish this, and from your understanding of the Iranian perspective, what do you think might, if anything, because I think, as everyone here knows, the last time they seemed to have suspended their program was right after the Iraq War, when I think they thought Bush might go after them and so on. So at least that is what a lot of people believe. So would any of these things make it? What's your percent?
I think in 2003 decision, that's absolutely right, and there's ample documentation, not just from Rouhani and others, to suggest that the threat of military intervention after Iraq, in conjunction with the reformist president in government, that was what provoked the suspension. I think a lot of the discussion here has the same underlying logic. As for a long time, it was suggested that the threat of crippling sanctions may change Ali Khamenei's mind and therefore his calculus. That didn't happen. That same logic is transferred to other issues. Maybe a more credible military threat invoked could change his mind and alter his calculus. Ali Khamenei doesn't make preemptive concessions. He doesn't make concessions for fear of fear. That's just not his style. It's not his style in domestic politics. It's not his style in international politics. His attitude is, let me see what you got and see if I can manage it. So I understand some of these measures and they'll be more robust, but I don't necessarily believe they'll be determinative in his conduct. In his history, in terms of his approach to domestic politics and international politics, he has not demonstrated that unless there is something remarkable and cataclysmic and existential, such as the 2003 intervention in Iraq and that brief period of success that intervention had. In terms of giving him one final agreement, arms control is an incremental process. It just is. It's just a step-by-step process. It just is. You give them a deal. Under the existing international system, they have a right to offer a counter-proposal. Once you're in an arms control paradigm, you're in a step-by-step paradigm. And it's very difficult to extricate oneself from it. So.
Dennis, you wanted
Ray,
to
let me ask
respond? Yeah.
If Ali Khamenei believes the U.S. is going to use force, will it change his behavior?
I don't know what exactly that means. How does he believe that United States, if he thinks United States, is he convinced that will invade Iran, that will change his calculus? Yeah.
So, in a sense, if he believes that we're not going to invade, but we would destroy their entire investment in their nuclear infrastructure, he would decide it's okay. He's willing to accept that.
I think that's a risk. That's a risk he'll tolerate.
Okay. On that provocative note, I'm going to start with first before. We have two microphones, so wait till the microphone comes to you. I see Professor Graham Allison, our old friend, right over here, from Harvard Kennedy School.
Very much interesting discussion. Question, what means nuclear weapons capability? Well, let me just give you two data points. Somebody mentioned the House Foreign Affairs Committee that reported on a bill recently that says, quote, it shall be the policy of the U.S. government to prevent Iran acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. And then, David, or Mike, I looked at your task force, and it says here it's going to address the challenge of Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability.
Yes.
So the question is, what means nuclear weapons capability?
Okay. I'll try that. I'm a moderator. Steve, why don't you address the difference between capability and weapons? The Obama administration generally used the term. Certainly, President Obama has talked about weapons. The Israelis, for instance, and others have talked about capability, and certain members of Congress have too.
Well, Professor Allison, I think you probably asked that question because you know what a difficult question it is. I mean, obviously, by some definitions, Iran has a clear nuclear weapons capability today. They're very, very far advanced in the amount of enriched material they have, and without a whole lot of additional effort, they could produce a nuclear weapon. The U.S. government has taken comfort in the fact that it continues to believe that we would at least detect a decision on their part to move in that direction before they could actually deploy or test a nuclear weapon. I think some of the discussion you've heard here from the panel goes to the question of for how much longer will we have that confidence that we can detect as the amount of enriched material they have increases and as the number of centrifuges they have available to use for a breakout should they choose to move in that direction. As that number increases, the window or the amount of time required for them to successfully, from a standing start, produce a nuclear weapon diminishes over time, and it's reduced substantially in recent years, and the trend line is clear. But if what we mean is ability to detect before they break out, I think that's what Netanyahu was getting at with his red line. He was asserting essentially that the amount of 20% enriched material, should it exceed a certain level, they would be able to break out before we could detect, and so that was where he drew his red line. And the Iranians have tried to circumvent that line in the manner that we've discussed earlier. So I guess the long and the short of it is that there's certainly no consensus answer to your question, except there's a hope that they don't have the capability to produce a weapon now before we can detect it. But the concern that animates a lot of us is that the amount of time they'll need is diminishing, and asymptotically, and at some point it will disappear entirely, or almost disappear entirely.
Mike,
Yes,
could I just
please.
Well, one thing I hope people will have seen about this panel is that it's a very lively group. But I think whatever differences some of us may have about different tactical aspects of this, the one thing that I think unites us all is that all of us believe that a nuclear-armed Iran would be extraordinarily dangerous for regional security and also incredibly difficult and expensive for the United States to manage in terms of its national interest. There are a lot of ways that a nuclear-armed Iran could present a problem. Iran with a tested nuclear weapon, which clearly meets whatever threshold Professor Allison would have set there, is already a very large problem. I think at least some of us, I can't speak for the other members of the panel, but at least some of us worry that an Iran well short of a tested nuclear weapon, but with, say, a latent nuclear capability like Japan, and that's something that Iranian officials have frequently talked about. They've said, we want to be treated like Japan, we want to be like Japan. What does it mean when they say they want to be like Japan? I mean, obviously, it's more than a linguistic difference that they're talking about. What they mean by that is it's widely assumed because of Japan's plutonium economy that if they chose to have a tested nuclear weapon, they could do it within about 6 months. And I'm pretty sure all of us believe that an Iran that had progressed to that point would be every bit as dangerous and maybe even more difficult to manage than an Iran that actually tested a nuclear weapon in terms of the threat to regional security, et cetera, because it would have a presumed, in the minds of regional powers, a presumed nuclear capability on short order that would enable it to use that use the weapons delivery system, say the burgeoning ballistic missile program, as an instrument of coercion, because people would not know whether ultimately they were dealing with conventional ballistic missiles or ones that very quickly could be armed with nuclear warheads.
Graham, I'm going to do some unusual. I'm just going to ask you, if just for the sake of debate, do you have a different view about how to define capability? You're one of the leading non-proliferation experts. What's you have a microphone over there back there? Oh, okay. Thanks.
I did ask the question with malice of forethought, and I would say.
Figured, yeah.
I mean, if you take Eric's answer, if Iran were only 6 months away from a bomb, that would be a terrifying event. I think that happened a long time ago. Okay. So, I mean, I thought you were talking about 9 days, soon, to at least
I was just
enough
using
material.
6 months as the presumption in the case of Japan. What the presumption would be in Iran's case, I think, would depend on status of the program.
The example that you gave,
Right.
that if they were like Iran, that is only like Japan, only 6 months away, that would be a riveting fact. I would say myself, they're certainly within that window already. So I think a lot of the declarations about nuclear weapons capability sound like they're talking about something that people know what it is, but actually have quite a mushy definition, which slides from time to time. I think we therefore should both, I mean, I recommend for the task force, but I think it would be too much to imagine that Congress, when passing a law, would have a definition that you would be able to tell what it means. Actually, this is by my count, I think, the 6th or 7th law or sense of the Senate resolution that's been, pronounced on these terms, none of which have included any definition. Now, if I were going to pick a definition, I would pick something that says, at a minimum, that we had confidence that that the effort to go the last mile would be detected with sufficient time for interruption before success. I mean, if I were trying to give some sense to it, but that would just be my view.
Yes, sir. Hey, wait till the microphone, and then I'll go over that side.
I wanted to ask Abe about Lloyd King and Spaulding. A different kind of question, but just broaden the scope a little bit. I've tried to listen very carefully, and I didn't take a great deal of hope and expectation from what I heard that Iran is going to make a significant concession. I've heard the president, military leaders say Iranian nuclear capability is unacceptable, but no one has defined that either. But supposing those that are going to have to decide if there is a new red line, where that is, what constitutes crossing it, and then what the consequences are, were to broaden considerations. If you listen to some of the commentators today, Iran now has a greater influence in Iraq than the U.S., that with their deployment of Hezbollah and others, that they're closer now to having control if they succeed in Syria, unless the U.S. and its allies enter. So having them control that region, which could be described as a significant part of the Middle East, what are the possibilities, and how would the calculation be affected if we signal, by whatever means we would signal, if in fact we were going to exercise a military option? I'm sure it would not be a secret that we'd have to position certain capabilities, and that would signal we're serious. But what would happen if we took those steps, signaled that we're serious, and if that didn't, because I think one of you said you thought that if Khomeini really believed we were going to use a military option, that may change him, that the steps that we would take, if we were going to exercise a military option, didn't result in a concession that was significant, that we then exercise the military option, because we have said at some point we're going to do that, Now it's even more important because apparently the president doesn't want to go into Syria, probably for some good reasons. I heard Secretary Kissinger say yesterday that he'd like to understand what the reasons would be for going in and the consequences before he knew the options. But if the decision now is broader, it's not just Iran, but it's the consequences of Iran, not only having nuke, but the influence. What would happen then? Thank you. Sorry for that's a long question.
Nice to see you, Lloyd. Dennis, do you want to?
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Because, I mean, on the one hand, you seem to be saying that if we were to go ahead and make the threat, and they didn't respond to the threat, and then we exercise the threat, that would relate only to the nuclear capabilities within Iran. Are you asking if they understood we were going to do something broader, not only as it relates to their nuclear capabilities in Iran, but also what they're trying to do in places like Syria? Is that what you're asking? Would that affect their, are you trying to get at what could affect their calculus?
No, I think what I'm saying is, wouldn't the calculus be affected given the current conditions that appear to be worsening in that region, including Syria?
Would whose calculus be affected?
Well, the U.S. and its allies calculate. If you assume, just to simplify it, that if Iran having a nuclear capability is unacceptable,
Yeah.
and I didn't hear of any of you give us any confidence, you don't think they're going to develop a nuclear capability, and if you look at the trend line, nothing seems to be deterring them. You can argue about the technical capabilities, but it seems to me that most observers believe nothing that we've done thus far has had any significant effect, some effect, but even that's debatable. So, all right, then if them having a nuclear capability is unacceptable, that means we're going to exercise a military option. Mm-hmm. Maybe now's the time to do that, but recognizing that it's sort of the last effort to achieve a concession. If they don't make any concession, they get the nuclear capability. One way to push it to the nth degree is to have them believe credibly that we are going to exercise the military option.
Well, yeah, that's what I was trying to say from my standpoint. Ray doesn't necessarily agree with that. My view is that, in fact, the only chance for diplomacy to succeed with them on the nuclear question is for them to understand that the failure of diplomacy is going to lead to the use of force, and they're going to be dramatically worse off as a result of it. In my mind, that's the only way that you have a chance to have diplomacy succeed at this point. And the real question is, the issue that was raised is, what is it you can do that will credibly convince them of that? I made some suggestions. Ray's attitude is that those kinds of moves are unlikely to affect the Supreme Leader's calculus, but the implication is that maybe the Supreme Leader's calculus can't be affected. And if that's the case, then the prospect of the use of force is quite high.
Well, back there. Switch to the other side of the room.
Jim Loeb, Interpress Service. I had two questions, if I may. The first was the original BPC report said that under no circumstances should Iran be permitted to enrich uranium on its territory, and I wondered if the new group here shared that belief. That dates back to 2008, particularly in light of Ambassador Ross's latest, well, not latest, they date back a year, statements on it. The second is I was very intrigued by Secretary Rademaker's kind of recounting of pressure and counter-pressure, and the fact that Iran is building what seems to be all this, well, seems to respond to sanctions by building up pressure of its own, by building up its capability. Does the panel see that, and does Mr. Rademaker in particular see that as Iran reacting to that, or the sanctions are reacting essentially to Iran's provocations? And if it is a question of Iran escalating the pressure by building up more capability, is there a way of de-escalation by well, reversing the process in a sense?
All right, actually, I think unfortunately this will be our last question. So Dennis and then Eric on the first question, is that okay? Or
Sure.
I guess my answer to your question would be, Eric said earlier that we are a group that shares certain basic objectives. We start with one objective. We do think that Iran having a nuclear weapon or weapons capability defined the way Graham put it, which was actually quite close to the way I thought Steve put it, is something that will transform the Middle East in a way. Already, the Middle East is already quite dangerous. It'll make it dramatically more dangerous, increase the prospect that you'll have a nuclear war in the area, not in any way serve America's interests, and leave us dramatically worse off. And so we, as a group, agree on that. I think we may disagree on whether the Iranians having the ability to having a negotiated outcome that would leave them with the ability to enrich in a very limited, restricted way is something that could be acceptable. I do have the view that at least it's worth making an offer to that effect. And I think others can speak for themselves why they think that's not the way to proceed. So we have a difference of opinion on that particular question, but not on the question of whether or not, at the end of the day, we can afford to live with Iran having nuclear weapons or being on the brink of having nuclear weapons.
Eric?
Yeah, I think, in part, the previous questioner alluded to, I think, the broader canvas against which this is taking place, which is to say that there is, to appropriate a phrase that was first used by, I guess, A.J.P. Taylor in the context of Europe and now by my friend Aaron Friedberg in the context of East Asia, a struggle for mastery going on in this region. And Iran is, I think, the main protagonist. The reality is that American administrations of both parties, dating back to President Carter and the Carter Doctrine, have made clear that in the first instance, he said that it was of vital interest to the United States that the region not be dominated by an outside power. By behavior, administrations of both parties have made it clear that it's also a vital interest not to see it dominated by an internal power. And obviously, a nuclear-capable, or even a presumed nuclear-capable, near-nuclear-capable Iran does enormous violence to that. I was not part of the group in 2008. I was still in government service. Mercifully, I'm no longer in government service. And I think that one of the reasons I joined the group was I found the initial reports actually quite compelling, but I'll leave it to Steve to...
I'll just add, just to explain, you're referring to a report of the Bipartisan Policy Center, when many of us were involved in before, now here at JINSA. Steve, did you want to just, and then we'll conclude.
Well, actually, the second part of the question was directed to me.
Yeah.
So let me just say on the first part of the question on enrichment, it continues to be my view that we should not agree to enrichment in Iran. But to turn to the second part of the question, I guess you were asking, well, let me say my point was that I think what Iran is doing in the area of enrichment is carefully calibrated with the diplomacy in mind. And I think you picked up on that and said, well, then maybe what you're saying is they're only doing this in response to what we do, so if we stop sanctioning, will they stop ratcheting up their enrichment program? You misunderstand me if you think that was the suggestion that I was trying to make with my observation. I think if we stop pressuring them, or if we abandon our goal of trying to prevent or seriously constrain enrichment in Iran, I think the situation we would face there would be much more dangerous than the one we face even today. In other words, I do not think it's the case that if we stop sanctioning them, they would stop trying to make progress with their enrichment program. the observation was made, I think, by Eric earlier that maybe what Iran wants is to be like Japan and be sitting on a lot of potential fissile material that they could rapidly fabricate into a weapon. I think actually a better model for what we might have an entire panel about what it is that Iran wants in the near term, but what I think they want is a better analogy would be North Korea between maybe the years 1996 and 2005. I think the record is pretty clear that starting about 1996, the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community was that North Korea probably had a nuclear weapon, but we didn't know for sure. We just didn't have the information, but based on what we knew, the probability was they had a nuclear weapon. Now, they proved that judgment was right in 2005 when they tested one, but for the 9 intervening years, there was sort of an open debate. There was uncertainty, and during that period, I think U.S. policymakers had to treat North Korea as if they had a nuclear weapon, but North Korea didn't really come in for the opprobrium that they would have come in for had it been certain that they had produced a nuclear weapon in violation of their nuclear non-proliferation treaty obligations. For a country like Iran, that doesn't want to be in North Korea, doesn't want to be subject, North Korea is basically indifferent to whether it's subject to international sanctions because their national policy is one of autarky. I think Iran actually wants to be integrated into the world economy, so they don't want to be treated in that manner. So putting themselves where North Korea was between 96 and 2005 is a pretty good place. Create uncertainty on our part and on the part of their neighbors about whether they actually have a nuclear weapon or are so close to having one that they might as well have one. So they get, in terms of the way they're treated, they get the respect, the deference that a nuclear armed state would get, but they don't come in for the opprobrium that a country would come in for if it clearly brought itself into violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And what they're doing in the area of centrifuge enrichment, and then I think in the near future in the area of plutonium production, they're trying to put themselves into that zone where we have to treat them, give them the deference that they would get, and other countries in the region have to give them the deference that they would give a nuclear armed state.
Ray, you wanted to since we started with you, we'll conclude with you. Okay.
During his speakership, the former presidential candidate Hadad Adal used to go around saying Iran wants to be an Islamic Japan. And the reformers used to taunt him, saying instead we became an Islamic North Korea. Eric cited AJP Taylor. If you read Ali Khamenei's speech, it kind of resembles Dennis's old professor, Malcolm Kerr, who talked about an Arab Cold War where the region is divided at that time in the 1960s between conservative monarchies and what they were at that time radical republics, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and so on. If you read Ali Khamenei's speeches consistently, he talks about a similar Cold War in the region where the divisions are between what he calls the forces of resistance and those that are essentially subservient to the American empire. And this is a conflict, in his view, that's playing itself out in Iraq, it's playing itself out in Syria, it's playing itself out in Lebanon, and it's playing itself out in Persian Gulf principalities. The only way Iran's nuclear calculations can be understood is in the context of that regional depiction. Namely, that it's the capacity that will empower Iran in this new Cold War that is likely to last even longer because it's underwritten not so much by imported ideologies, but by sectarian identities and more ancient hatreds. So on that happy note, I'll stop.
on that upbeat note, look, first of all, I want to thank our very distinguished panelists. I don't think you'll find more knowledgeable panelists than these on this issue. Again, all of them are members of the new JINSA task force on Iran. I encourage you to keep following us. We're going to be putting out, as I said, a series of papers on this issue and events to hopefully influence at such a critical time as we heard before, as Eric and others emphasized, such a critical time in Iran policy. And I look forward to seeing you at future JINSA events. Thanks for coming. Bye.